Hey everybody, Marshall here to share some really cool news with you. I trust at this point you've all heard about Kvik yeast. This is that Norwegian ale strain that can ferment cleanly at temperatures as high as, no joke, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 38 degrees Celsius. Absolutely crazy stuff. Well, last year, Imperial Yeast dropped A43 Loki, their Kvik strain, as a seasonal release, which meant we all had a pretty small window to get our hands on some. Not anymore. Imperial Yeast recently announced they're making A43 Loki a year-round strain due to popular demand. They're excited about it. I'm super excited about it. I've had some amazing beers fermented with Loki at terrifyingly warm temperatures. It is amazing stuff. Go grab some A43 Loki and see what all the fuss is about for yourself. In the quest to pack as much hoppy goodness into beer as possible, brewers have come up with myriad interesting methods, some inspired by scientific research and others stemming from personal anecdote of trusted brewing figures. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me live from Hop Harvest in Yakima, Washington to talk about the curious method of adding two separate dry hop doses are Brewlosophy contributors Brian Hall and Jake Houlihan, as well as Wandering Hops, Nathan Cooper. What's going on, guys?
What up?
How's it going? It's great to be here for Fresh Hop.
It sure is.
Time. It's not a festival.
International Wet Hop Days.
I know. Wait, Jake, I'm going to... Jake just woke up. Jake's had a really good weekend so far, apparently. It is 2:20 in the afternoon, and we had to wake Jake up to come down to be on this show. If you guys listened to the episode from last week, Nathan is with us again because we didn't really move. We ate some lunch and got back on the mics. And on this episode, we are going to talk about a double dry hopping. It's a really interesting method. I know that I used it quite a bit for a while until I stopped using the double dry hop method. I think it'll be fun to talk about our experiences doing that.
Yeah, so when we think about double dry hopping, what is double dry hopping? So that's going to be the process of adding hops at the end of fermentation or even during active fermentation. Some people do that, but then adding a second dose. So really just kind of double or even triple adding those dry hops at the end of fermentation.
Right. And in the world of New England IPA with talk of biotransformation, it's kind of had a resurgence. I've seen this idea of adding multiple doses of dry hops. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about different ways to do that in this episode. I think it's going to be a good one. If you're into this thing that we're doing here on the podcast and you'd like to make sure that we keep doing it, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy by visiting patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rad rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at Yakima Valley Hops, where we're sitting right now, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Past guests have included folks like Michael Tonsmeyer, John Palmer, Gordon Strong, and many others, and all past sessions are available on our private Facebook page so you can watch whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're shopping online. Your experience doesn't change at all. We get a little kickback that keeps us going on. Feedback this week is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who offer brewers an array of beautiful stainless equipment like the turnkey BH15 Pilot Brewing System, which has a hard plumb manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brew process. Brewers Hardware also has a ton of unique purpose-built products useful to both professionals and home brewers. Go see for yourself at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. And sticking with our hop theme, listener Alice Carey wrote in with some feedback on our recent dry hop saturation point episode. We got a lot of feedback on that one. I thought this was some pretty good one. At the end of the podcast, this is what Alice said. She goes, at the end of the podcast, you said you were interested in comparing beers that are dry hopped below and above the 8 grams per liter threshold. I actually did this a few months ago. I split a batch of IPA between 2 carboys, dry hopped half with 3 ounces and the other half with 6 ounces, all Centennial. I didn't do anything official, but myself and everyone I shared the beers with easily noticed a difference between them. The one with 6 ounce dry hop was hoppier, but both were good. Now, I'm assuming that Alice was doing like standard 5.5 gallon homebrew batches, which would mean that she used 85 grams versus 170 grams, which ultimately boils down to about 4.5 grams per liter versus 9 grams per liter. So yeah, that's awesome. That is a perfect example of what I was talking about at the end of that episode, comparing actually doing a lower dose and a higher dose above that 8 gram per liter threshold just to see what that difference would be.
Right. And that makes a lot of sense too. I mean, you think about that dosage, it does seem a little bit on the lower side, where we're really bumping that up is going to increase that hoppiness. I mean, I've definitely noticed it when I add bigger doses, but I don't think I've ever gotten to that 8 grams per liter that Cade tested out.
Yeah, it's not. You'd be surprised actually. So I think what we came to is that it's about between 4.5 to 6 grams per liter, or I'm sorry, 4.5 to 6 ounces for a 5-gallon batch. In the dry hop, which a lot of people are doing that already. Again, when we talk about double dry hopping, I think it turns into a different beast. And Shellhammer makes a point to say that, he tested it with just Cascade. I don't know if they've done other varieties, but I have to imagine that it's probably the same or similar, at least for other varieties. But yeah, cool stuff, Alice. Next time, maybe collect some data and send it to us, because I love reading. Or
send us
some
of
stuff.
the beers.
Yeah. Of course we'll always drink your beer. So.
Or check out the Brew Club. They do experiments as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
That'd be a great way to get it published out there.
Absolutely. And if anybody out there is doing their own experiments and they want it published, they want to share that stuff with the folks who read on brewlosophy.com, join the Brew Club. That's one of the things that we offer members, is the opportunity to have their experiment published on the website. Thanks again for your feedback, Alice. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Now, I remember the first time I served my buddy Jersey a hazy New England IPA. Not only was it his first time trying one, it was the first version that I'd made, and he actually loved it. It was a pretty good New England IPA for my first attempt, I thought. Now, it wasn't murky like a lot of the ones you see on the internet these days. But since then, of course, we've all consumed gallons of this stuff. We're drinking some of Nate's right now. Some good, some bad. Well, listeners Zach and Tom sent me a bottle of a New England IPA loaded with Citra, Motueka, and Mosaic.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Wow. Look at that, Jersey. That's a juicy IPA. Just by looking
Orange
at
juice soup, dude. New England IPA for sure.
This is grapefruit right here.
Oh, wow. You ain't kidding.
I hate to admit this, but the more I'm drinking this IPA shit,
You don't know it's an IPA yet. You
I
haven't
don't
drank
know.
it.
I don't know, but
What were you about to say?
I'm liking them.
Oh, you.
I know.
Look at what's happening to you.
I know.
Oh, my science, dude.
This is full on juniper.
There's a juniper in there.
Yes, there is. See, I couldn't drink this very much.
I know that someone put their heart and soul into this. It's just not for us. We're
It's
not.
not for
we're
me.
not experts. We're not experts.
Just when I thought I was growing up and started liking
No,
IPAs.
I know you're just singing IPA's praises.
Maybe I need a diet IPA. This is not me.
So it's like super strong, right?
Yes.
Super strong, super piney with fruit in there. I'm gonna guess that this is a New England IPA. That's my guess. But it's like so strong.
Yeah.
I remember when Marshall took me traveling around to different breweries, and we had the cool thing was to have these super unfiltered, like strong, cloudy.
Very cloudy.
This is too much for me.
Yeah. I'm not liking it.
Good night, Sweet Prince.
Raw.
For this style of beer, I'm sure that there's a group of people that would love this.
This one I thought I was growing up.
One Jersey. I mean,
Yeah,
I drank a few sips. It's just not for me, man. It's too strong.
Yeah, we'll do the 0 on that one for me.
All right, Zach and Tom said another iteration of this beer fared well in this year's NHC, which is awesome. Kudos to those guys. But unfortunately, I kind of have to agree with Jersey and Tim to the extent that the beer really just had this like pungent pininess that, and it was bitter. It was far more bitter than what I think most people brewing New England IPA are aiming for. I don't know what exactly would cause that, other than maybe adding too many hops up front in the boil. You've got experience brewing these all the time.
Yeah, one of the things is hop contact with wort, like the amount of time it's sitting in there, at what temperature. Like for us, we don't add anything during the boil for 95% of our hazies. We just wait till post-boil, whirlpool, drop the temp a little bit. And different temperatures will yield different results. Like we found with Mosaic, a 10-degree difference makes a massive difference.
Really?
And yeah, we did Mosaic originally at, I want to say 175, and we'd do 20 minutes and then chill it and transfer. And it just came out with like a sharpness to it. But then we'd turn around and do it at 185, and that seemed to be the sweet spot for us. So it was, different hops play different, I guess, with the temperatures and the amount of contact they get with the wort. Right.
And I know that there's a lot of talk lately about bitterness that comes from the dry hopping component. And I don't know if maybe that played a role in this.
Yeah, it also kind of depends how you're calculating your IBUs.
Yeah.
A lot of people use different types of software to do that, and people will put in their Whirlpool editions differently, or they'll put in flame out editions. If they were doing a flame out edition, but then it took a while to start chilling. You've got a lot of contact time there as well.
What's weird to me about New England IPA is that as a fan of West Coast IPA, I really enjoy a nice crisp Union Jack or whatever. There's a fair, arguably an assertive bitterness to a lot of those styles or Pacific Northwest style IPAs that I find really appealing and tasty. But when you mix that with whatever else is going on in a hazy IPA, it's not something that I enjoy too much.
I've kind of always thought that. I'm right there with you. Like I love the West Coast IPA and haven't really loved the hazy beers too much, but being out here, like all these fresh hop beers we're having are hazy as hell. Yeah. And I don't even think it's like they're not trying to add haze in many of them. I think it's just these fresh hops contribute this super haze to them, but they're so good.
Yeah. If you had woken up for the last episode that we recorded, that was a big portion of what we talked about.
We covered that.
Yeah. It is interesting. But Zach and Tom, I really do appreciate you sending us this beer, and I'm glad that a version of it did well in competition. I don't think it was bad. There was an aspect of viscosity to this beer. I don't know how you would get that in there, because I've made beers with really high amounts of flaked oats. I use the same yeast. They say they use London Ale 3, so that's Boddington's, right?
Yeah. Ropiness, you mean?
It wasn't ropey, dude.
Okay.
It was just thick.
Was it like
thick?
oat milk?
Oat milk. There you go.
Yeah, it was a bit, yeah.
That might have.
That's
that
actually a
could
good
be
descriptor.
it.
Yeah. So, but again, I appreciate you guys sending it in. It may not have been our favorite, but if you like it, that's what matters the most. And I'm sure that there are other people out there who love it as well. If you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage reviewed by Jersey and Tim on the show, you can email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. All right, we'll be back after these messages from our sponsors. So I've been hanging out with brewers and craft beer nerds for a long time now, and while we do occasionally have our differences, one thing it seems we all share is a love of learning and trying new things, as well as saving a couple of bucks. Well, right now, Craft Beer and Brewing is helping fans of Brewlosophy learn more while saving some coin by offering 20% off the price of a subscription to their awesome magazine. Chock full of brewing insights, tips, and recipes from industry experts, Craft Beer and Brewing is seriously great. I read every issue page to page myself. To get 20% off your subscription, all you have to do is sign up at beerandbrewing.com/brewlosophy. Want to brew quality craft beer at home? The Grainfather provides a brewing system with superior design, innovative features, and the latest technology, allowing you to brew professional quality craft beer at home. Mash, sparge, boil, and cool all in one unit, meaning there's less equipment to use, clean, and store. No need for burners or hot plates. Just plug it in and brew great beer. Then get the best out of your fermentation with the Grainfather conical fermenters and glycol chiller. Plus, enhance your brewing experience with the brand new free-to-use Grainfather community app. You can take your brewing tools and your recipes with you everywhere, use brewing calculators on the fly, manage your recipes, and monitor your brew session from anywhere. Use your mobile device to manage your Grainfather brew wirelessly, automate mash schedules, and multitask without removing any of the brewing hands-on fun. Grainfather products can all be found at www.grainfather.com. Plus, as a Brewlosophy podcast listener, get 10% off your order. Just use discount code Brewlosophy19 at checkout. That's BRULosophy19 to receive 10% off your order. So head to shop.grainfather.com now to get this great deal. Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Xchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Xchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Xchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to Xchillerator.com today. There are some ideas in brewing that on the surface seem to make at least some sense, and then there are those that I honestly don't understand the reason behind. Despite the fact that I used to add 2 separate dry hop charges to my IPA all the time for a while, the concept was one I never really understood. I know that both of you, all 3 of us, 4 of us sitting here today, I can't count, have experience with double dry hopping. This is one of those things. It's one of the few methods that I adopted early on in my IPA brewing. I don't brew as much IPA anymore these days, but back when I was, I kind of adopted it because of appeal to authority. I heard somebody talking about it on another podcast, and I thought, well, if they're doing it, I should do it. It obviously works, but just the thought of it never really made sense. If you're adding them all at one point, I don't see how that's going to change anything if you split it up, like why it would be different than if you were to split them up.
I thought originally the idea was longer, at least, back in the day, the idea was that longer dry hop contact times meant grassier flavors or more vegetal style flavors, and a shorter contact time would mean brighter flavors, was what I heard originally. And so the idea being that, okay, if you let this sit in here for 12 days and then add a little burst of 3-day at the end, you're going to get both worlds, was how it was presented to me when I first heard about it. But I didn't really start getting into it till later than you did, probably about 5 years ago.
Yeah.
I'm definitely the same as Brian. So when I first started brewing and I was doing those dry hopped IPAs, you throw them in a Molson bag, drop that Molson bag in there, let it sit for 7 days, because I'd been told, 7 days is like the max you want dry hops.
Oh,
in
yeah.
there. So then I'd pull that bag out and add a second dose in a separate bag for another 7 days, which, I mean, now you look back and you're just like horrified at what you were doing. But still, yeah, I mean, it made sense on some level. If you accept the premise that after 7 days it's going to be grassy. So that's kind of why I did that.
Yeah. On the professional scale, before we talk, we're going to get into New England IPA and why people might double dry hop for that. But just on the, as you were, growing in your professional experience, was this something that you did normally, or did you mess around with it at all? Or
we never did it to begin with. Once it started gaining traction, obviously on the East Coast, like DDH this, DDH that.
I remember cans would advertise that it was double dry hopped all the time. Yeah.
And that was a huge thing. And just recently we did HBC 369, which is our 369 Damn She Fine 100% Mosaic hazy IPA. So that was such a huge hit for us. I was like, well, what if we just added more hops? Again, my train of thought. And so we did DDH 369. Well, nobody over here knew what that was. So I kept getting messages, hey, it says DDH on this keg. What does that even mean? I was like, well, we double dry hopped it. And the general response is like, well, why?
Yeah.
I'm like, well, you liked this much Mosaic. What if I gave you twice as much Mosaic? And it didn't taste the same. We got kind of a little bit of backlash from it. It wasn't as big of a hit for us. So we've only done it a few times. Haven't really noticed incredible results from it. I mean, it's essentially just me dumping more money into the fermenter. And
that's what I was going to say. I feel like from a marketing perspective, when you say double anything, it makes it feel like there's, and who doesn't love hops, right? So it makes it feel like you're going to get more hop character, but at the same time, you would effectively use the same amount of hops if you did a single dry hop, right? That concept, I guess I hadn't really considered that. The concept of contact time in the beer.
Just layering flavor is the idea.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's interesting. I did it, like I said, every IPA I made for probably 3 or 4 years.
Wow. I didn't get into it until I started talking with Ed Coffey, and he was talking about layering flavor using double dry hopping, and that's it. I started doing it.
My biggest concerns when it comes to dry hopping in general, particularly like West Coast style clear IPA, stuff like that. My biggest concern is cold side oxidation. And so for me, that rather than having that one potential vector of oxidation, you've now created 2, and some people were doing triple dry hops and all that kind of stuff. And you are going to introduce oxygen by dry hopping. I mean, you can't avoid that. And so that was, that's why that was the original reason I stopped before I did the experiment. We'll talk about in a bit. But.
Yeah, no, I stopped just because I was feeling lazier, to be honest with you. I mean, it's like, and brewing more New England IPA, I was concerned about the oxidation. Right. So I would just dry hop at the tail end of fermentation. But and Nate and I were talking about this a little bit before, not to side rail too much, but like, we were drinking some of these fruity beers early, and what I was telling him that I do with the fruit is I will fruit sour beers for like 6 months, and then when I go to keg them, I'll do a microdose is essentially the best word I have for it, is I'll put in a very small amount of fruit. Like when I normally fruit, I'm using 3 pounds per gallon. I'll put in like 2 cups just in the keg a little bit. And I've started doing that with some of my New Englands just to play around with it, is I'll do a very small amount of keg hopping, just a little bit to try and get a little burst of fresh. But the original reason I stopped doing it altogether a while ago was because, I'd make a beer and it would taste better to me, a week or 2 later. So at that point, it's like, why am I going to try and layer in a bunch of flavors that I just want to have mellow out anyways?
Yeah. What if it's that fresh dry hop character that you kind of don't like as much, right?
I like a little bit of it, which is why I've been playing around with this microdosing concept. Yeah. But then you're concerned about oxidation because there isn't a way that on the homebrew level that I've found to completely purge a keg and introduce hops.
Yeah. like I said, when I think about double dry hopping, our friend Jamil Zainashev comes to mind. He's the person that I heard talking about it on a podcast years and years ago. Must have been almost a decade ago now. And I think a lot of people back then just kind of took his advice almost as gospel, which isn't a bad thing. I mean, he makes great beer, and I think a lot of us got better because of the advice he gave. But I couldn't find in my research, I don't know about Jake, maybe you dug a little deeper than me, but I couldn't find any like references to dry hopping twice before that I could trace back to being, coming before what Jamil was doing. I did hear Vinny is doing it with Pliny.
That's where I first heard of it. I mean, I wasn't even on the interwebs doing anything brewing until you and I met. And so the only thing I'd done is downloaded our Russian River clone. And I was like, he puts it in for 12 days here?
Yeah.
3 days on the tail end. I was like, all right, I'll give that a try.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, really, it seems like from like a professional brewing literature standpoint, it didn't really seem like there was much. I couldn't really find anything about that, but it did seem like Vinny, being probably the most famous brewer with the most famous beer back in the early 2000s.
It's true. Yeah.
That probably influenced that. I know like Tasty and Jamil were super big in with Vinny at that time, and they started telling homebrewers about double dry hopping, and it seems like it took off from there.
Yeah, all of my friends back then. How long were you homebrewing, or like when did you start homebrewing, Nate?
Probably like 5 years ago.
5 years ago, and then you just went straight commercial. You are crazy.
Yeah,
God.
Yeah. Took balls.
Yeah. The all of my friends were double dry hopping. It was just you didn't even question it. We just did it. And I remember reading that Pliny, it was almost 2 weeks. Remember what I like my little note to myself was 2 weeks, and then a weekend you add another one, and so that's where you get your 2 weeks. And so you got 1 week and 2 week effectively. And I mean, if you've had Pliny, which we've all had, it's an amazingly good beer. So something's going right there. Is it necessary? I mean, I guess that's the question.
Yeah, really, that is the question. Like, does adding that second charge of hops bring something like closer to kegging? I mean, it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Because as soon as you add those hops, they're extracting flavors, doing all sorts of great stuff to that beer. But does adding one more dose closer to kegging get you a little bit more of that flavor at packaging? And then, like Brian said, with layering of flavors.
Yeah, that idea of longer contact time, extracting different characters. Have you ever left a dry hop charge on a beer for a little too long?
Yeah.
What do you?
What's too long?
What do you give from that?
We just did one. It was a hazy that was supposed to be like a 4-day dry hop, and scheduling got messed up. We left it on for 8 days. So when you look at some of the hop descriptors you'll get, it's like piney, resinous, tropical, and you're like, how are you going to get both of those flavors? I think that's how.
Yeah.
Too much contact, and you'll start to draw more of the vegetal side of the aroma. And when, like Brian was saying, when it's short in there, it's that sweet like burst of the tropical notes. So I think that's where the layering might make sense to me, I guess.
I totally just remembered I forgot to take a beer off the hops that I have back home right now.
Oh,
That's going to be in there for a week.
So what I've gotten when I've done that, I've forgotten to take beers or packaged beers in time, and what I get is like I hate this flavor. It's like tea. It tastes like tea, and I do not want that in my IPA at all. I want that so far from my IPA, but that seems to be what I get. It's not even grassy. I remember people talking about grassy all the time. You mentioned that we were talking between recording here, and you mentioned, Nathan, that Brew One, if you overuse it, you can get kind of a burnt plastic thing,
like a rubbery.
Yeah. Oh, it's one of the worst things. I've gotten that as well when you leave it on the dry hops too long. But it's weird because there's this thing that can happen when you can take two things that may not be great and blend them, and it can create magic. You know what I mean? That synergy between these two things. And I wonder, I doubt Vinny would be making Pliny. I doubt Pliny the Elder would be the amazing beer it is today if it's because of a plastic character to it. You know what I mean? But I wonder if there's not some sort of synergy that does happen with maybe certain varieties or something.
Yeah, I mean, maybe there is some of that. A light vegetal grassy note combined with a shorter dry hop that does add a little more fullness to the overall experience.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I'm hoping for at this point when I get home.
I mean, like, I know we've been talking about Pliny a ton here, but I do have a Pliny clone on tap right now that I brewed for an experiment that's upcoming. And those beers sat on the dry hops for 14 days. Now that was in a unit tank, so maybe that's maybe that forgives a little bit of stuff from the homebrew side of things. But those beers taste great. I don't get any grassiness out of them.
Yeah, I mean that's a different variable in and of itself is dry hop length, right? And I think that's something we've all any brewer who's made an IPA has messed around with that. The idea of adding 2 doses to break that up. And I think most people, I mean, when I was double dry hopping, the approach that I would take is I'd look at my dry hop charge and I would cut all of them in half. So if I was dry hopping with, let's say, Cascade, Centennial, and Citra, and it was 30 grams of each, I would just do 15 grams of each, as soon towards the tail end of fermentation. Then I'd go back and add the other ones 3 or 4 days later.
Yeah, with mine, I would do a little more than half. Just because I was figuring, all right, I'm gonna split this up. Might as well boost them a little bit. So instead of doing 6 ounces, I do 2 4-ounce dry hops.
Okay. Yeah. Now New England IPA. There's a different reason that people have started doing double dry hopping when it comes to New England IPA.
Marketing. I swear that's what it is. It sounds awesome.
Yeah, we'll leave that alone for now. But there's a lot of talk about biotransformation when it comes to New England IPA. Again, that is a variable on its own. We can have a whole other show about that, or I think we already do.
We did.
Yeah, we do. But this concept that by adding a dry hop charge at high Kreuzen or during fermentation, that the interaction between the yeast and the compounds in that hop biotransforms certain terpenes into other more desirable, maybe not more desirable, but certain desirable characteristics. For example, citronellol is from a geraniol. So you basically take, if my understanding is correct, you're basically, the concept is that by dry hopping with something high in geraniol, which is a flowery terpene, a really floral, then with certain yeast interactions will produce that really citrusy, juicy, quote unquote, juicy character. And so people, what I hear from a lot of people who double dry hop their New England IPA, because essentially what they're doing is hoping to get that biotransformation and then going back and adding more of the regular hop character in the dry hop that they want. They're hoping to get that typical dry hop character.
I think that's what they are hoping for. I think when you said certain yeast, that touches on what we went over back in that episode, and people can go back and listen to that. But the idea that there are only certain yeast that that allow that process to happen.
Right, that have the ability to biotransform. And there's been a lot of research on this lately. I'm sure Shellhammer's doing some of that. I know I've talked to Mike Tonsmeyer about this stuff, and the conditions have to be pretty ideal in order for that to happen. But when it comes to double dry hopping, it actually does make sense to me why people would do that. You make a lot of hazies. Are you double dry hopping yours?
We do it every once in a while just to kind of experiment. Mm-hmm. On our experimental lineup, we'll double dry hop. Like, we'll do the initial hop charge. I'll take a sample of it 3 or 4 days in, and if it's not what I want, we'll do an additional. And typically it's either splitting what we originally planned on doing, or I'll just do a massive dry hop, test it out, and if some of the hop character and the aroma's fallen off within a few days, we'll just do it again, give it 2 days, and just package it fresh.
Yeah.
So you're getting some of those original aromas that you'll see on the hop descriptors, but then you're getting just that massive punch that by the time it's delivered to some of our accounts, they're like, wow, this is intense.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, so Brian and I have messed around with it a lot. Was it something that you were doing? Did you double dry hop the Pliny clone that you have on tap now? Or?
Right, that one is. I mean, for a long time, I was just adding dry hops during fermentation just because I was so afraid of that cold side oxidation, as everybody knows. But I just found I wasn't quite getting that same flavor profile that I wanted from a dry hop. So I did start doing that one, initially, so you can scrub out the oxygen of that dry hop charge, but then adding a second one, like at kegging or packaging, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting one to me. The one part that I keep going back to now, when it comes to New England IPA, if I'm making a hazy IPA, I'm adding the hops, all of them, during high Kreuzen, because I want to do, given how sensitive it is, and maybe we're off on that, but it seems way more sensitive than most other beers. Given how sensitive it is, I'm taking every step to avoid cold side oxidation that I can. And to me, adding hops at high Kreuzen, I've even gone as far as throwing the hops in at yeast pitch. You'd be surprised. You'd be surprised how much hop character you get when you do that. And that started because I was brewing with a buddy one time, and he, his first batch, and he read I went inside to take care of a kid, and I go back out and I was like, where'd those hops go? He's like, oh, I put them in. It says there's dry hop there, right under the yeast, right on the Beersmith thing. So he added it, and we just rolled with it, and ended up being really good. I mean, you're still getting that hop character. And if there is biotransformationing possibly happening, it's going to happen then. Going back and adding another dose after that makes sense to me. That does, because if that is the case, right, then you are getting these two different characteristics. The one that doesn't, I still till this day doesn't really make much sense, except for time on the hops. If that does have an impact, and I do believe we have an experiment that we've done on that dry hop length, then that, I guess that makes sense. But when you hear people talk about the negative characteristics of dry hops, it's almost always associated with too long, right? Too long on the dry hop.
Should we talk a little bit about some techniques for double dry hopping?
Yeah.
So, I mean, me personally, I like to add that second dose about 3 days before kegging. I find that it really allows the hops some time to get some flavors in there, but not too much. I'd be interested to hear what you guys are doing, especially Nate.
Well, fine.
Yeah. Sorry, why don't you tell us, Nate? What are you doing?
Well, so when we're double dry hopping, we'll do pretty much day 3 of activity. Tanks usually sitting at about 72 degrees, so it's a little bit warmer. We'll do that, let it sit for 4 days. We'll drop it to 60. This is where it sucks being commercial. Like when I was doing our homebrew size, I'd throw hops on yeast all day long. We'd dump the yeast and it'd be gone. But right now we're having to use 3 or 4 strains. And so I can't throw hops directly on top of the active yeast. So now we're single hopping most of our big name IPAs. But when we're on the pilot, it's 72 degrees, probably second or third day of fermentation. And then like he was saying, like the last 2 or 3 days right before we go to keg it, we'll do another charge of hops. And I mean, those are some of the best tasting batches of those small little controlled ones that are just blasted with hops and on the warmer side with active yeast.
That brings up something else that I hadn't considered with double dry hopping as well, is if temperature extracts different characteristics, I could see an argument for, dry hopping one at 72, dropping down the temp to maybe 55 or something like that, dry hopping again. And if those extract different characteristics, now talk about layering of flavors, right?
Yeah.
So that makes sense to me. What techniques are you using? You said you're dry hopping, Jake, three days before
that's
kegging?
what I like to. Obviously, like life happens, especially in home brewing, and that doesn't always end up being the case. But I like to go about 3 days before packaging. I found it, like I said, it creates like good flavors and not too much of like any one thing.
Yeah, I almost always, I read a paper, it may have been Shellhammer actually, about that, like after 24 hours, you've basically gotten the most out of your dry hop charge. And so I don't double dry hop anymore. Back in the day when I was doing it though, what I was doing was waiting until the tail end of fermentation. I wasn't dry hopping during, I thought that was bad, like bad practice to dry hop during active fermentation. So I'd wait until there was probably 1 degree Plato left. And in fermentation, just judging based on airlock activity.
Oh yeah, that's the old one Plato bubble.
The old one Oh, you get good at predicting when you use yeast over and over and over again. But anyways, I'm assuming that's about where it was at, and I would add that first dose, and then like you, 1 day before packaging, so a full 24 hours, 36 hours, I'd add that dose of dry hops, and then I'd crash immediately, like within 2 or 3 hours, I'd crash it. And that my thinking there was that you've got the hops in there, and that as you're crashing, that the beer is still warm. It takes a while for it to cool off. So after the 24 hours, it would have spent time. Those new hops, that new dose would have spent time, kind of soaking in saturating the beer, as it were.
Totally. And what about kind of like that cold side oxidation side of things? Are we taking any steps when we add that second dose, or are we just throwing it in there, closing it back up? Are we purging? Are we doing anything like that?
I can tell you how I used to do things.
I've made them every which way. I've done it just in the carboy whereas I'm dumping some in during fermentation when I was subscribing to the biotransformation idea, and then
why you don't subscribe to that anymore?
No, and then I would add some in, and I would just I would scoop up a thing and I would just dump it right in the top of the carboy, and I'd end up using a racking cane just to rack it into the keg, and never had it go purple. Those are the ones I was bringing to the homebrew festivals a couple years ago.
No, I mean it's crazy that like we've all gotten so concerned now about cold side oxidation, and Brian was just making these amazing New England IPAs.
I know.
3 years ago doing nothing.
And Brian was telling me, he was like, how are you guys making these purple beers? He's like,
I've never had one come out purple, and I don't know, maybe it's just dumb luck, but it's like, if you're adding, there is a significant, or not, I don't know if it's significant, but there is an amount of CO2 that does stay in solution in the beer, even though it's done fermenting. And it's not like I would let them sit for 2 weeks before I'd dry hop them. So I would dry hop during fermentation. I would let it finish. I would dry hop it again, let it sit for 24 hours, and package it.
Yeah, I don't know how you've gotten away with that. To me, it's the easiest thing to do is make a bad NE IPA. And you just don't.
We just brew the hard way.
I feel like we're kissing your ass. Yeah.
For it.
Maybe it's because you're making beer in Alaska. But like I said, I used to double dry hop as a matter of course. Curious to see if it was actually having a positive impact. I put it to the test. Results when we return. When dumping wort-soaked grain and leftover low-gravity wort while cleaning up after a brew day, did you ever wonder what your true efficiency would be if that wort made its way to the kettle instead? Using the brew bag, a fabric filter for all mash tuns and brewing methods, allows you to capture every last drop of wort. Not only does this increase kettle efficiency, it lowers your grain bill, which saves you money. Throwing wort in the trash is like dumping a 12-pack down the drain and just doesn't make sense. Use the brew bag and leave no wort behind. I've been using these filters for a long time and recommend them to everyone. I never have to worry about a stuck sparge, and cleanup is fast and easy. Go grab yourself a brew bag fabric filter at brewinabag.com and be sure to use code TBP17 at checkout to get a discount on your order. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. I recall the moment I first began questioning whether my process of adding 2 separate dry hop doses was actually beneficial. A friend of mine who also brews was hanging out in my garage when I remembered that I needed to add a second dry hop charge to a batch of IPA. He questioned why I split the dry hop up. I told him it was because it increased hop character, or so I thought. He asked how I knew that. I responded with personal experience. Which was basically just an appeal to authority because I hadn't tested it out. Neurotic that I am, I knew that I had to test it out for myself and went with a simple double dry hopped IPA. Well, one of them was single dry hopped. I brewed a single 6-gallon batch of IPA. This was actually an interesting one because it was served a dual purpose. Some local friends of mine and I were all making a Lancelot IPA. That's House of Pendragon's, their house IPA. It's really, really good. We did get the recipe. I can't share it here. You don't share recipes sometimes. But this was the recipe back mid-2015. And I think 5 of us brewed up this recipe, and we all did our own little like home brewing spins on it. And then we compared them. Well, I had to make it an experiment because that's what I do. So mashed it 154 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 68 C for 60 minutes. I used the no sparge method. Again, this was just a 6-gallon batch. So 2 3-gallon fermentations. Boiled the wort for 60 minutes. Got a hit a Magnum first wort hop, and then a mix of popular varieties for 20-minute hop stand. That was it. So even back then, this is like your classic West Coast IPA. A little bit of Magnum up front, and then all Whirlpool hop. After the boil, I chilled the wort and split it evenly between 2 identical sanitized carboys, each one receiving exactly 3 gallons, or I don't know if it was exactly 3 gallons, but they were even at least. So there was the same amount in each carboy. I pitched equal amounts of a WLP 090 San Diego Super Yeast starter, which I made a few days prior, and then I let them ferment at 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Or 19 C. Now, this is where the variable comes into play. After 5 days of fermentation, one of the batches was dry hopped with an entire 5-ounce blend of hops, while the other was hit with half that amount for an equal variety or equal ratio variety. So what I did there was, I think there was 3 different hop varieties that were in use in this beer at the time. And so I just split them up so that the ratios were the same for each, the single dry hop dose and the double one. The ratios were the same, very least. For those interested, this was, because we've been talking about Shellhammer a lot, given this was a 3-gallon batch, that's a dry hop rate of just over 12 grams per liter. That's a lot of dry hops.
I was just trying to calculate that. That's insane.
Oh, I did it for you. I do 12 grams per liter. The other 2.5 grams of hops, anyways, were stored in a vacuum sealed, thing, thrown in my freezer. And then 2 days after I added that 5-ounce dry hop charge and the 2.5 ounces to the other batch, I added the other 2.5 ounces. So there's a 2-day break between those. The beers were left alone for 2 more days. So in all, I believe the dry hop in total was only 4 or 5 days, which that's if it is this dry hop length is the issue. So I measured used hydrometer, and I measured the FG. Both were identical, at which point I cold crashed the beers. Find them both with gelatin. You can poo-poo that if you like. And I kegged them up. The kegs were put on gas in my Keyser, burst carbonated, and served to tasters within a week of packaging. Now, I've never heard anybody talk about a negative impact on appearance of doing a double dry hop. And in this case, it could have been because they were fined with gelatin, but both were crystal clear and looked identical. So no difference whatsoever in terms of appearance. In my own personal blind triangle tests, I could not consistently pick the unique sample out at all. They smelled, tasted exactly the same to me. There was nothing different about them, which I think right off the bat on a personal anecdotal level kind of proved to me, at least in this one scenario, that double dry hopping a West Coast style IPA just may not have that big of an impact. I don't know.
Yeah, that is super surprising. I would have thought going into that, tasting those beers, I would have thought that the double dry hopped beer would have probably tasted like a little bit fresher, have like a bigger hop punch, more of those like citrusy flavors. But of course, I don't know what hops you used in that.
If I recall correctly, it was like Centennial, Azacca, and Citra, I think, something like that. Some popular hops, yeah. No, I expected the same thing. And again, I'm going into this one as somebody who had been double dry hopping, convinced that it made a difference. I'm going into this fully expecting to taste the difference, and I just could not. I mean, they were absolutely identical. And again, just to put it out, that's one batch got 3-gallon batch got 5 ounces of dry hops that I believe set on for 4 or 5 days. The other batch got 2.5 that was on it for 4 or 5 days, and another 2.5 that was on it for 2 days. I mean, you would fully expect, at least in my thinking at the time, that you would at least get that fresher dry hop character out of the one that was dry hopped twice. But
yeah, that's totally what I would expect. I mean, they were added closer to packaging. You treated everything else the same, you would think.
Yeah.
It just makes sense, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I couldn't tell them apart, but that's not what matters, right? It's the blind tasters that we served these to. This was back in the days when I was only getting 15 participants, not 20. Yeah, we're so astute now. So I served these to 15 people, out of which 9 would have had to identify the odd beer out in order for us to say that there was a significant, perceptibly significant difference. In all, just 27%. So 4 out of 15 people identified the odd beer out. And I remember talking with these folks, and after they did the triangle test, not a single one was confident these beers were different. It was random guessing. I mean, 4 out of 15, that's a quarter of you expect 33% at random chance. It was less than that. That doesn't mean anything other than these beers just were not perceptibly different.
Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, it's cool that the data kind of backs up your personal anecdote with it. I find that it seems like that's the case more often than not with all of us.
Yeah.
But super crazy.
Yeah.
I have to wonder though, like maybe because the dry hop charge was so big, maybe that kind of impacted it and diminished the difference that it could have been.
That is exactly my thinking. It was so far over that 8 grams per liter saturation point. That was my thinking is, if 8 grams per liter matters, right? And the science seems to back that up. It really does seem to saturate for a dry hop at that point. If that's the case, then 2.5 grams for a 3-gallon batch is pretty much pushing that limit already. I mean, 5 ounces for a 3-gallon batch is way over that limit. So it could be saturated at that lower level already anyways. I would still think though that you would get something fresher, something punchy or whatever out of that second dose of hops. Even because if it's saturated, then you're still adding more of something to it. I mean, you would think that you'd get something. And I'm telling you, man, I could not. These beers tasted exactly the same to me. Kind of wild. So, at least in this particular experiment, using the specific hops, that's how we have to talk about it, right? I used a very specific set of hops. Maybe it would have been different if they were different varieties or not, but
the idea of being fully saturated does kind of resonate with my thoughts. I also kind of wonder, you talked about serving them a week and a half later. I wonder if there is a difference. You're talking about dry hopping in two separate instances that are, what do you say, 4 days apart, and then you're not serving for a week and a half later. So maybe that has something to do with it. I don't know.
I mean, back then, if you served an IPA a week after it was kegged, that was fresh. I mean, And
I know you're gonna laugh at me. I do wonder if the gelatin finding had anything to do with that at all.
No, so do I. I mean,
I know everybody says, "Oh, well, you find it and it doesn't matter," and I'm not saying that. I just wonder if it did affect it at all. But I do think the saturation thing is interesting.
Yeah, there's a reason we don't find hoppy experiment beers anymore because people complained about it, and even though our science seems to say it doesn't have that.
I'm not saying that it did change. I'm just saying that that's the only other thing that's going through my head.
But to be able to remove that argument, right? To be able to, because if I hadn't done that and people still couldn't taste it, then you couldn't blame it on gelatin.
Mm-hmm. But no, I mean, you're doing massive hopping. So I don't know. I don't find it terribly surprising. And now if you would have said, I did a 12-day and a 2-day and I did more, I don't know. If you would have, I don't know. I guess I would, longer times would be more surprising to me, I guess, is all I'm trying to say.
That's where I'm at too. I think if we were to redo this experiment, I would want to do basically what Vinny does is compare one that gets probably a less dry hops overall, maybe right up to that 8 grams per liter. So 4 grams per liter plus 4 grams per liter separated, and then the other one 8 grams. I probably want to do a single hop beer as well, just so that you're not throwing in the variable of multiple hop additions. And then definitely add one dose first for 7 days, and then add the other one for another 7 days or something like that.
Because we're saying that you and I read the same thing. I think it was on Scott's blog. About hops, their maximum saturation being after 24 hours or 36 hours or something like that. So after that point, you're getting, at least I've noticed, I feel like you get more of the vegetal grassy side of things if you're going on 2 weeks, like Russian River purportedly does with their Pliny. So, yeah,
it's interesting. Are you double dry hopping after?
In all my pilsners that I'm making, am I double dry hopping? Not really. I typically just don't dry hop that much. I do like it. I think it creates like a great beer, and being up here has kind of rekindled my love for the IPAs that I seem to have lost over the past few years. But, no, not really. Probably just single hop because it's easy.
I think Nate's approach is a great one, and that's kind of where I've come into play with the keg hopping. Is the idea is like taste it, and if you feel like it needs more, then give it a little boost.
That is arguably another form of double dry hopping. Is if you do a dry hop in the primary, or if you racked a secondary or whatever, But then you toss in another dose in the keg.
Keg hopping is double dry hopping.
It's your double dry
I
hopping.
think at least. Yeah.
And it's I've never done it. You know why I've never keg hopped is because I don't have ball lock kegs, and so I have nothing to hang the hops off of in my keg.
I don't hang them off at all. I've got a canister, and I mean, if I have a beer that hasn't been drank, sometimes we'll do 2 or 3 New England IPAs in a row for some of the experiments that we're doing, and they don't all get drank right away, and they'll sit for a while, and I'll actually just combine them all into one keg. And because sometimes it's like, okay, we can't tell the difference between these anyways. Put them all in one keg and throw in a charge of dry hops in a canister, and it rejuvenates it.
So how do you? That's a good. If we're afraid of cold side oxidation, apparently you've got the magical touch so that your beers don't ever screw up. But how do you? What are you doing? You just tossing them in and hoping for the best?
So I'll transfer all the beers into one keg, and then I will release all of the pressure out of the keg, keeping the gas still attached. And as soon as that pressure is out and I have that lid just loose enough that I can do it, I turn the gas back on and flood it at 20 psi, and I just keep that running continuously until I've got the lid back on. So I do fly through a little more gas, but it's worth it rather than having to dump a batch.
So on the commercial scale, though, you can't really keg hop like commercially.
No.
Yeah.
Back when I was doing it homebrew, I'd do the same thing. I had a stainless T-ball, and I would just pack that thing full of pellets, open the top like you were doing with some gas, and then just pop it in. I'd try and clip it to something, but 90% of the time just fell to the bottom of the keg, and that was life. But it was still killer.
My only concern would be that it would clog the dip tube.
Yeah, if you have a stainless mesh screen around the dip tube, it's pretty effective at stopping that.
The 12-inch canisters.
Yeah.
Those ones, the mesh is fine enough. I've never had a clog on those.
Yeah, it's what is that 300 micron or something like that?
I think it's 300. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I use too. So I'll have to try that.
So I know Sabco makes like half barrel Sankey kegs, but they put the ball lock top on them so that like we could screw around with something like that, like injecting it with something. But
there's a new top that just came out too that goes on Sankey kegs. It's a triclover fitting, and it's got a ball and it's got ball, gas, and
that would be cool.
What am I trying to say? Liquid.
PRV.
Yeah. We've all been drinking this afternoon. So.
Have you ever tried using a what is it called, like a Randalizer or a hop rocket inline when serving?
Yeah. It was
just for that quad experience.
It was a nightmare. I mean, it was a cleanup nightmare, but it was a lot of fun. We had a beer that was just not very popular with people, and we dumped a bunch of fruit in the Randall and advertised it, and it was the most popular saison I've ever seen.
Have you done it with hops though? Like
we haven't done it with hops.
I've had that a couple times.
How was it?
It was good. I mean, I think it depends at which point you get it, because it's like if it's something that you're continually serving, it's okay. But it's like if it's something you're pulling a pint off of, every other day, it's like those hops it's sitting with a ton of hops for a longer amount of time.
Yeah.
There used to be a brewery by me that would do French presses. So they would just have hops in the store. You get a French press. They pour the beer over the hops, and then you let it sit for like 5 minutes and push it down.
I've tried that.
Novel.
It's so strong though.
I bet it's bitter, huh? I bet it gets super bitter. Yeah,
super strong. It's one of those things. Again, microdose.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. I stopped double dry hopping as soon as I got my experience in this one, and I haven't gone back to it. I think I've maybe brewed 10 IPAs since 2015, so it's not like I'm making them a lot, anyways. I don't see a point of going back to double dry hopping, but I do like this concept of keg hopping. I think it's kind of cool.
You were mentioning before the show about the study saying that 8 grams per liter was optimal, but I think you meant, and correct me if I'm wrong, you did mention something about when there was double dry hopping. It wasn't directly linear, but there was a higher level of saturation.
Yeah, I can't cite the reference now because we are sitting at Yakima Valley Hops drinking beer while we're recording.
No, that's fine.
But I did read something about, it was another Shellhammer article about double dry hopping there seems to be some potential for increasing that saturation point. So rather than it being 8 grams per liter, it could be a little bit more. So you could essentially get more hop character or dry hop character into a beer by splitting that dry hop dose up. Don't quote me on that.
Sure.
You might want to go look for yourself, Google Scholar that or something. But it does seem like that there could be some potential there for that. Again, sort of like with this experiment, I think one of the possible caveats was that we were so far beyond that saturation point anyways, that could explain the reason we didn't get that layered effect or that, whatever else you expect from a double dry hop. So We did get a bunch of reader comments on this one, and surprisingly, all of them were very long. Usually it's like 2 sentences. We got like paragraphs. So we're going to go ahead and go through these. The first one comes from Matt. He says, I haven't tested my method single variably, but I feel like it makes the most sense from a theoretical standpoint. Welcome to brewing, right? We do this so much, and it makes sense. I do the same thing. For almost all IPAs, I dry hop half the hops in primary, then transfer to keg. Add the hops to a 1 gallon paint strainer bag and then suspend those towards the top of the keg. Oh, here you go. Using unflavored dental floss that I tie to the top of the keg. I pressurize the keg and keep it at room temp for several days. Then I put it in my kegerator to carb. After the keg is carbed and I start drinking it, the bag with the hops will stay suspended towards the top of the keg so that it's not in contact with the beer over the life of the keg. I feel like adding them in the keg keeps the hop aromas locked in the beer as opposed to primary or secondary where they can escape. Perhaps I could just skip the first dry hop and only do the keg hops. But in general, I'm kegging 10 to 14 days after brewing, and I usually want to add the first dry hop 5 to 7 days after the brewing. So the schedule seems to work out well with double dry hopping.
No, I think that's super interesting, and I've always had really good success with keg hopping. So I like the approach for his method there, and I do use that dental floss too. Works out nicely.
I tried once. I tried suspending a bag in my, and I thought I was like, oh, this is gonna be great. I've never done this. It's something new. Because I don't have the little hook on the bottom of my lids because I'm pin lock, I hung it out and I loaded up the lube, wouldn't seal. I lost a half thing of freaking CO2.
Yeah, I'm just lazy. I don't want to have to worry about hanging something from here or there. And
the dangle.
The only time that I put it in is if the keg's halfway empty anyways, just to give it a little extra boost. Yeah. So, I don't mind letting them sit on. They don't last that long anyways. So,
I bet you wish you could do it.
That'd be great.
I
think it'd be awesome.
We were at Haas and they're talking about all these. What are they calling them now? The future products or something like that, where they're not actually they're made from hops, but they're not hops, so that you can do more things like that. I have a feeling that we're going to see a lot of flavoring hop products that are not vegetal in nature, so that you can dose a keg, a purged keg with some sort of a oil or whatever, and then rack your beer in there, and that's your dry hop character or whatever.
We had like 2 beers there with no vegetal matter in them at all.
Oh my God.
They were incredible.
How weird was that? I know. Yeah. Beers made with hop products that aren't hops.
I mean, eventually I think we'll get to the point where it'll be kind of like the way Berliner Weiss is served, where it's like, you have the base Berliner Weiss and they pump a couple little bits of fruit into it. It'll be like we just brew a generic base beer and we're just pumping in whatever whatever hop flavor you want on top of that.
Moloko,
whatever blend you want.
That's an Agent Orange or a Clockwork Orange reference.
Oh, okay.
Our friend Derek Springer, he says, I think this is another case of, quote, homebrewers don't need to do things like professional brewers. My understanding is that the double dry hop technique started because of the scale/geometry of 100-plus barrel tanks caused the dry hops to form layers of hop where there was no contact with the beer. After a certain amount, there was literally no extra benefit to adding more hops. To get around this, brewers would add N sets of dry hops where N is greater than 1. One after the last addition added everything it could. So if there was an inner layer, it didn't matter. The geometry of homebrew-sized vessels, however, doesn't have this problem or only manifests itself with way more dry hops than folks would use.
I mean, Nate, are you guys doing anything to mix your dry hops once you add them? I know there's some things available for commercial brewers to do that.
Yeah, if we're using like the T35, the lupulin powder, we can hook up a pump to it and just kind of recirculate in the tank so it does get maximum contact. But I mean, that's actually pretty accurate. Like I know a lot of brewers are getting their fermenters custom done with the dry hopping port, like front dead center, so that it's getting better contact. Whereas like when I'm dumping in a 22-pound bag, it's just running down the side and just kind of sludging up in an area, and I'm not going to put a paddle in there and shake it around or do anything. So
no,
I've heard a lot of people doing that, bubbling up CO2 from the bottom.
Yeah, we'll rouse the bottom just to kind of mix things up, because I mean that does make sense. A lot of the times, if you've taken out the whatever you're dropping in the keg, you just see this big old clumpy log, and I mean, it makes sense.
It's such a bummer too. Like shit. I mean, I put all these hops in. I want to get So I think it makes a lot of sense as well. I've heard people from way back in the day, even on homebrewing, figuring out ways to stick a CO2 wand, down in their carboy and bubbling up CO2 to stir up the
shake it,
charge or shake it up. Yeah. Some people like to do just more
cold slide oxidation.
Anything to rouse the bottom.
Yeah, for not to affect him. I know. All right. Ben commented, he said, I admit to not being a hophead. Never been into hoppy beers for my own reasons, but the few times I've made an IPA, I've tried different hopping schedules. To be honest, I've never noticed a difference between a single, double, or even a triple dry hopping schedule. In my opinion, our home brewing is on too small a scale to have any kind of noticeable difference in the finished product. Again, kind of going along with a matter of scale. And I do think that that's a decent argument in this case, that if double dry hop was a function of getting around some issue, then yeah, it makes way more sense on the commercial scale if we don't have to worry about it, and if the results of this experiment are valid enough, at least that really doing a double dry hop chart just may not really make that big of a difference, then yeah, the commercial scale thing, I think it's a decent argument. All right, next comment comes from Tom. He says, I started double dry hopping when I switched over to using a 14-gallon conical. It seemed like I wasn't getting the same dry hop potency in my IPAs when I remembered from batches dry hopped in carboys. My only theory on this was that the big 5-ounce dose of dry hops was getting piled up on itself in the bottom of the cone and reducing the surface area contact with the beer. I typically only keep beer on the hops for about 4 days, so I tried cutting the dose in half and dry hopping twice, 2 to 3 days apart, and that seems to have helped quite a bit. I haven't done any quantitative testing of this, but I do believe that how you manage hop beer contact area can have an effect. With carboys, I'd get noticeably more dry hop aroma when I added the pellets directly to the beer and let them naturally settle in a layer on the bottom rather than using weighted hop bags.
That's super interesting. And that Pliny clone I was talking about earlier, I did make that in my unit tanks, and I was kind of worried about that. Like, as soon as I dump in these large dry hop doses, are they just going to go sit right down in that bottom cone? And then if I do any dumping, like, is it going to lose all of that? The beer, it came out good, but obviously I'm not comparing it to a control that I'm brewing in like a carboy itself, but that's something I've had fears about for sure.
Yeah. I guess you could call the fermenters I'm using now conical-esque, the Flex Plus from Spike, and then the brew buckets from SS Brewtech. They do both have, conical bottoms on them. I've only been using the stainless, like hop spider looking things for dry hopping. I haven't dry hopped loose in years. So that wouldn't be an issue for me, I guess. But there are times if I overpack one of those things where there'll be like a dry core,
I use 2 of them per batch now when I'm doing mine, just to let the hops spread out. And I do agitate mine ever so slightly just to let a little circulation happen.
Yeah. I've never done the agitation thing. We did a really interesting experiment. Greg did, where he dry hopped with a stir bar.
Yeah, that was amazing.
Yeah. And he let it run for what? Was it 24 hours or something? Yeah. It's crazy.
I'll have to try that. I've got those Maelstrom ones. They're supposed to spin a 5-gallon carboy. That'd be kind of fun to do.
Yeah. Interesting experiment. We'll have to talk about that one later. So, all right. Our final comment comes from Justin. New England IPAs might have a case for a double dry hop. I think we talked about this. If the first addition was added during active fermentation, then biotransformation could take place, giving one set of flavors and aromas. Then if the second set of hops was added post-fermentation, you could get a whole different flavor and aroma contribution. So instead of just doubling up on the flavor and aroma, which this experiment shows doesn't do much or doesn't seem to do much, you could get a beer with additional hop flavor and aroma.
If your biotransformation is actually causing different flavors and aromas, then theoretically that might work.
Yeah. There is also, though, if you're throwing in dry hops during high krausen, I do think there's an argument to be made for the fact that it's probably it's going to be sit in contact with those hops a little bit longer than if you were throwing them in post fermentation. So whether biotransformation is happening or not, which based on the research, it doesn't seem to be a thing that's occurring as often as people think.
Yeah, it depends on what you're using. Go listen to the episode.
and also, we didn't really talk about like blow off of aromas and volatiles, but if you're adding that first dose, maybe during active fermentation, theoretically, maybe some of those aromas do blow off during fermentation.
My buddy ran the calculations on how much gas is released during fermentation, and it's astounding how much is pushed out.
It's amazing. I believe Drew Beecham was telling me it's something like 40 times the volume of what, I don't know if that's exactly right, but
it's something like that.
Yeah, 40 times
very large. That makes sense.
That'd be an interesting way, like capture that CO2, because I've been doing CO2 capture lately. I love it, and then I use it to purge the keg that I end up putting the beer in, and so there, it's getting whatever flavors you would expect from the beer anyway, so it's not a big deal. But I do wonder if that CO2 has some compounds in it that you might, you know what I mean?
So it definitely does. My buddy works for a German company that manufactures a CO2 recapture unit for breweries, and they have to go through multiple levels of filtration to get that CO2 pure enough to be used for beer.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, hey, that's all the time that we've got for this show. I want to open up a couple of more beers with you guys, and maybe record a Brew&A episode, which you'll hear next week. Do you guys have any other questions, or not questions, but do you have any other comments on double dry hopping before we get going?
I think the very last one was pretty solid. Like the last comment, putting it in during biotransformation. Yeah, you're going to get those crazy flavors, but say you're only 20% done with fermentation. You've still got, say, another week. You're going to leave those hops in there for another week.
Right.
You're definitely going to need that second dry hop addition, or you're just going to get vegetal, some off flavors.
Yeah. But anecdotally, I mean, I subscribed to the whole biotransformation thing for a while. Not that I'd say that I don't, but I don't really feel like it affects my beer as much as I thought it did. And I would put them in midway, and I never really felt like I got a lot of vegetal. I don't know whether it's blowing off or whether there's something else going on. I'm making all these hand gestures nobody else can see.
Oh, we see it. I like I said before, I'm not making many hoppy beers. I don't plan on reintegrating the double dry hop method back into my process. That being said, I am interested to see if we were to reduce that total dry hop amount and split it up, if we might, that might produce a more perceptible difference. Again, that's just for another experiment. Don't forget to head over to brewlosophy.com to read up on the experiment discussed in this episode, as well as all of the other stuff we're up to. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.